Well, good afternoon. If you are in New York City or Boston or Laval in the province of Quebec or anywhere in North or South America, good evening if you are in Lisbon or Luxembourg or Brussels, a lot of places we may cover today, or Vienna or Sarajevo or Budapest. Greetings to people all around the world. Special love to our loved ones in Ukraine. This is Fred Plotkin on Fridays, and I'm Fred Plotkin. We're on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. As you well know by now, Adagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera and everything about them available to fans around the world. My guest today is an old friend. Sometimes even with your old friends, you don't begin to understand everything they know and care about. And I knew that my friend Larry Wolff, who is a professor of history at New York University, very accomplished, loves opera, specializes in what I call Central European history, for lack of a better term. You can correct me, Larry. But Larry has just produced a book called, it's a big heavy book, but it's worth your reading, The Shadow of the Empress, Fairy Tale Opera and the End of the Habsburg Monarchy, by Larry Wolff. It is a fascinating, complex, complicated, fascinating book that I read thoroughly, very carefully, making all kinds of notes, because not too long, a couple of years ago, I had Alex Ross on talking about his book, Wagnerism, which is a book about the impact of Wagner elsewhere in the arts and politics and culture and so on. And I've not read a book since then that has that same kind of global reach that is both daring, but also achieves what it sets out to do. I think you achieved it. You'll have to tell me what you set out to do, Larry. But I'm going to quickly surmise it and then have Larry go deep into it. It's about the Habsburg Empire. It's about culture in Austria and all the lands that Austria dominated until 1918, but then everything that followed. It's also about one particular opera by Richard Strauss and Hugo von Hofmannsthal, Strauss being a Bavarian, Hofmannsthal an Austrian, called Die Frau ohne Schatten, the woman without a shadow, that I think they set out to write one thing, and then when world events happened, the opera became a whole other thing in addition to what they set out to do. And the creation of the opera began before World War I. The premiere of the opera happened after World War I ended. I will only say that I think that Strauss and Hofmannsthal, and I think Larry thinks this too, intended that Austria, Germany, its allies, would be winning the First World War. Instead, they lost. And therefore, what the opera says and its meaning ever since is very different than what perhaps the creators intended. Am I right so far, Larry?
That's so exactly right, Fred. And I'm very touched that you read the book so carefully and thought about it so deeply, because you know so much more about opera than I do, and your engagement with the subject means a lot to me.
Thank you. But an opera that I still am trying to figure out after more than 45 years of seeing it is Die Frau ohne Schatten. So you're going to help me today. Larry, I want to start with certain basics. Number one, what is the correct spelling of Habsburg?
With a B, Habsburg.
Why do we often see
that's how they would have spelled it. The P is an anglicization that that nobody uses anymore, I don't think.
Okay. I, in some of my writings, have used it, so I'll go and correct that. The second question is massive, but I want you to do it as succinctly as possible, maybe using 5 minutes. Describe the history of the Habsburgs, where they began, how they took power first in Vienna, if it was first in Vienna, how they expanded. And we don't have to say how they fell, we'll get into that. But who were they up until 1914?
Great question. How many minutes do I have? Can I do it?
5, 7, take what you want.
Okay,
You're
no, I can do it. I'll do it faster. The Habsburgs emerge in the Middle Ages as the Archdukes of Austria. And in the period of the Renaissance, they are able to leverage their positions as Archdukes of Austria into being elected as Holy Roman Emperors. So from the 15th century up until the abolition of the Holy Roman Empire in the early 19th century, they are the Holy Roman Emperors, the heirs of medieval Charlemagne, the dominant power in Germany. And for a long time, they also control as a family Spain and the New World. That is to say, the southern portion of what we think of as the United States was once part of the Habsburg World Empire. Holy Roman emperors up until, let's say, the 18th century, when the state begins to change and they begin to transform themselves into what we would think of as a modern state in the Age of Enlightenment, a modern bureaucratic military state. And as they emerge from the Napoleonic Wars into the 19th century, what becomes clear is that they're a complicated multinational state, far-flung in Central Europe, but we wouldn't have called them multinational before the 19th century because nationalism itself is not a meaningful concept up until the 19th century. So the modern history of the Habsburg monarchy in the 19th century is the history of what it means for an empire, one country, to adjust to the fact that it rules over and administers multiple nationalities, and to try to figure out how to govern properly and fairly an empire that consists of Germans, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Croatians, Bosnians, Italians, Romanians, Hungarians, and Ukrainians, because Western Ukraine was also part of the Habsburg monarchy. When you read about the bombing of Lviv by the Russians, you're reading about the Habsburg monarchy, the former Habsburg monarchy under assault. The Habsburg monarchy makes very interesting adjustments over the course of the 19th century, becomes a constitutional monarchy over the course of the later 19th century, from 1867 on forwards, has universal male suffrage after 1907, and might be with us in some fashion to this day, were it not for the First World War, which the Habsburgs enter along as Germany's ally and lose decisively as Germany does, which pulls the empire apart into multiple national states that you can see on the map of Central Europe today. And Central Europe, I think, is just the right word to use to describe the former space that was governed by the Habsburgs. Very interesting territory to think about also in the history of opera. It's one of the places where Baroque opera flourishes in the late 17th century. Emperor Leopold is himself a composer in the late 17th century. It is in the 18th century, the Habsburg capital, Vienna, is a site where Mozart creates his operatic masterpieces. In the 19th century, the Vienna Opera House becomes one of the Hof opera, the court opera, becomes one of the great forces in European opera. By the very end of the 19th century, Gustav Mahler becomes the musical director of the court opera in a crucially formative period. And for Hofmannsthal, at least, who is very Viennese, Die Frauen aus Schatten, emerges out of a long tradition of thinking about opera in relation to the Habsburg monarchy. How's that for a capsule history?
That's excellent. And I'm
anything
just
I've missed that you want me to go back to?
I'm just going to add a couple of things. One of them is the Habsburgs are notable to me that there has always been a presence of important women. It's not that the women were always in charge, though they sometimes were, like Maria Theresa from 1740 to 1780. But also, and this connects to the women, a lot of fertility, a lot of the production of heirs and spares and children to be married off in strategic marriages all around Europe. And a lot of the foreign policy of the Habsburgs that I've seen is about making marriages with people who are potentially enemies, but could become allies or be neutralized by the marriage. And that the use of children was highly strategic in the Habsburg foreign policy. Am I on the right track with that?
That's absolutely correct. It's the empire building tool of the Habsburgs in the early 16th century. It's how they acquire the crowns of Bohemia and Hungary, for instance, through marital alliances. But it's an ongoing diplomatic tool, which sometimes works out very well and sometimes works out very poorly. For instance, Empress Maria Theresa, whom you mentioned, the most powerful woman in Habsburg history, does faithfully marry off her daughter Marie Antoinette to the future Louis XVI. And we know that ends badly for Marie Antoinette. Maria Theresa's grandson, Franz, marries off his daughter, Marie-Louise, to Napoleon in the early 19th century, which ends badly in a different way. But it's something the Habsburgs are very, very alert to at all times, the diplomatic significance of marriage within what remains a dynastic enterprise for them from beginning to end, even after it becomes what I've described as a constitutional modern state.
And therefore the avoidance in some cases of wars of invasion, because the occupation is being done with a marriage, so to speak.
There's a slogan that's associated with the Habsburgs in the Renaissance: "Bella gerant ali," others wage war, to Felix Austria nube, to happy Austria marry.
Yep. And I'm going to throw in something parenthetical that comes out of my working life and study. You know that I was an Italian history major and focused on opera and Italy, and especially Venice, which was under Austrian occupation for a very long time. Various Verdi operas were written in response to the Austrian occupation. La Scala in some way was built up with Austrian involvement. Certainly Trieste was the port of the Austrian Empire, and a lot of the wood that came in to build the violence and such in Vienna came from Trieste and nearby. And the center of Trieste is called the Borgo Teresiano, named for Maria Theresa, and it looks like Vienna on the Adriatic. It's architecturally much more Viennese than Italian. But I researched a book in the 1990s that I published in 1998 or 99 called 2001, called La Terra Fortunata, about the food and wine of Friuli, Venezia, Giulia, the Northeast. But what the book really became, and I would have named it differently if I didn't have a project already to do that, was the food of the Habsburg Empire. Because in studying Trieste as a port, and where the roads, the ancient Roman roads, led to Ljubljana and to Budapest and so on, and Vienna from the Adriatic, I came to learn about the food connections that wound up in the Naschmarkt in Vienna, not too far from the State Opera and Theater an der Wien, and how the food influences and the commerce influences the commercialization of coffee, baking, that the first refrigerated railway car went from Trieste to Vienna to bring fish from the Adriatic to Vienna. All of this was of a piece with Habsburg influence, and how the Habsburg table was not necessarily as opulent, say, as the French imperial table or the Russian or the British, but rather it was upper middle class, and it was aspirational for the middle classes of Vienna to eat the way the emperor ate. And the foods of Vienna, which I was fortunate to study at the Judenplatzer's State School Academy, really reflect the commerce of Austria and the Austrian Empire, and then later the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And for example, just one thing is the Kipfel, which are these little crescent rolls, arrived from Turkey, and they were crescent shaped. And when the Turks invaded Austria in 1683, among the things that were left were coffee and phyllo dough that became strudel, and Kipfel, or crescents, which became Kipfel, which Maria Antoinette, brought to Paris, and they became croissants. So these connections are all fascinating. And I just take that as one example. Larry's book, The Shadow of the Empress, is full of these kind of connections, not just in food, but in opera and politics and culture and mores. And it's so much more than, I will say, just a book of history, or just a book about opera, or just a book about Larry. It's all of this together in a very fascinating way. So, having established a bit who the Habsburgs were to 1914, who was Hugo von Hofmannsthal up to the creation of this book?
Love that question.
Sorry, of this opera.
I want to preface it just by saying that what you just said before really hits the nail on the head in a very important way that most people don't understand about the relationship between the Habsburg Empire and Italy. That is to say, in terms of culture, in terms of food, in terms of music, in terms of politics, they are so closely connected and intertwined over the course of centuries, do not become separated out until the second half of the 19th century. And it makes a lot of sense to think about them together. Just as you say, La Scala is created as a Habsburg opera house in Habsburg Milan, which is a Habsburg city for 3 centuries. And when Salieri comes to create the first opera to be presented as the premiere at La Scala in the late 18th century, he's coming from Vienna to do it.
That was L'Europa Riconosciuta in 1778.
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
So Hofmannsthal was part Italian himself. His grandmother was a noblewoman from Milan, Petronilla von Roh. And in that sense, he's someone who reflects a lot of his family history, reflects a lot of the complexity of the whole old Habsburg monarchy. He has a von in his name, V-O-N, which makes him a nobleman, because his great-grandfather was a Jewish silk merchant who was ennobled by the emperor in the early 19th century. The family forces that shape him are Jewish and German and Italian. He's very much a Habsburg subject himself. Born in 1874, the most astonishing thing about Hofmannsthal, and it was the thing that was astonishing to his contemporaries, is that he became a famous poet at the age of 17. He was writing verse under an assumed name, so no one would know. He was a high school student. Important critic asks whether he can meet the author of these beautiful verses and is astonished to find himself meeting with a high school student. And we would still say that the verses that Hofmannsthal writes as a late teenager, right, in his late teens and early 20s, are among the great lyric poetry of the German language. And that's something that's hard to account for. When people talk about him in the late 19th century, the comparison they reach for is Mozart. That is to say, the idea of a prodigy whose youthful genius is something that you really can't understand or explain. Hofmannsthal, after creating great lyric poetry as a teenager, in his 20s undergoes a spiritual crisis as a young man, is somewhat tormented by a sense of his own preciousness, and gives up lyric poetry forever. In his 20s, writes a kind of manifesto about his crisis of language. And what he turns to instead is drama, And from drama, he ends up becoming an opera librettist. He does a German translation of Sophocles' Electra, which Richard Strauss picks up and decides that he can make into an opera, following up on Salome, which was Strauss's first opera, or not his very first, but his first very successful opera, and then with Electra as his second. And after that, he turns to Hofmannsthal and they agree that they're going to collaborate on something together. And that something turns out to be Der Rosenkavalier, one of the great operas of the early 20th century, or of any century. You're not a fan of the Rosenkavalier, so performed all over the world to the present moment. Was performed at the Met last season very successfully. We could talk about Der Rosenkavalier, but it's for them. It's what at the end of Casablanca they call the beginning of a beautiful friendship, and they work together on Der Rosenkavalier, Ariadne auf Naxos, Die Frauen Schatten, Die Ägyptische Helena, and Arabella.
Yeah.
Have I missed something? I think those are the
No.
5 principal works that they collaborate on. And if Hofmannsthal is known to a global public today, it's not for his early verse, which it would only be known in the context of people who care a lot about German literature, but it would be as the librettist of Der Rosenkavalier. And Hofmannsthal's aware of that working with Strauss is bringing him to a much bigger public than writing lyric poetry is likely to do. He's very much a figure of Vienna, born in the world of the old Habsburg Monarchy in 1874, survives into the post-war world of the 1920s, when the Habsburg Monarchy has been divided into its component national parts. He becomes an Austrian living in the state of Austria, which roughly has the same boundaries that we'd be looking at on the map today. His big enterprise in the new Austria is...
We're going to get there. Don't go.
Okay.
We're going to get to that. I know what you mean.
Just
I know what you mean.
Stop me.
That's 1920.
Know exactly where I'm going to go with this.
That's 1920. We're going to get to that after Die Frauen Schatten. But therefore, we have, for our listeners, begun to lay the groundwork of the history of the Habsburgs, of Hugo von Hofmannsthal. You mentioned parenthetically that he had Jewish parentage. There was a lot of anti-Semitism in Vienna and in the empire, but there was also a lot of incredible Jewish creativity and impact. Sigmund Freud, who was born in 1856, redefined how we describe the passions of the mind and human motivation and so on. And I mentioned that not as pro or against, but he gave a vocabulary to the human mind that was certainly taken up in Vienna by creative artists who explored it that way, and then elsewhere, but first in Vienna. I just parenthetically, I found it interesting that you mentioned that Hofmannsthal's family were silk merchants, because our friend Richard Wagner made a lot of money from the Wesendonck family. They were silk merchants and they supported him for a very long time. Silk, by the way, came from China to Milan in the Middle Ages, and mulberry trees were planted north of Milan around Lake Como. And Como was and still is the silk capital of Europe. And so that tradition of silk and fine Italian fashions, made of silk neckties and so on. The curtain of the Metropolitan Opera is silk from Como. It's all connected, is all I can say about that. But with the arrival of Der Rosenkavalier in 1913 and his successful premiere, not in Vienna, but in Dresden, by the way, I see that opera, which has many merits. It has glorious music. It has a couple of interesting characters and a lot of annoying stage business that I would just get rid of. But to me, that feels like nostalgia for the old Habsburg world. Now, the former Metropolitan Opera production that everyone knows, and there's a comparable production like it in Munich and Vienna, is of that sort of rose-tinted nostalgia and that smell of, old perfume and so on, that I never much cared for. The Met now has a Robert Carson production that updates the staging to the time when the opera was created, 1913 rather than 1730 or 40. And to me, it makes a lot more sense because you understand the context of the opera that the creators were working in. In other words, that you could feel, even if there was not a declared World War I yet or Great War, that things were changing in Vienna and for the Habsburgs. And that opera, especially in some of the characters, reflects that. It used the device of, let's say, influence of Mozart's Le Nozze di Figaro and some of the characters there. The next opera that, and did I leave anything out about Rosenkavalier before we go to Frau und Schatten?
What I would say about it is that it reflects a certain kind of historical nostalgia for the world of the 18th century, but a very great historian of Vienna, Karl Schorsky, once said to me that for him, Der Rosenkavalier is a modernist work because it's very self-conscious in its historicism. He sees it as an opera that takes leave of historicism in the same way that the Marschallin renounces at the end of the opera. Strauss and Hofmannsthal are renouncing historicism as they conclude Der Rosenkavalier. I don't know whether you buy that, but I was very moved by it.
I see the point, but I think also that people who attend that opera attend looking for the nostalgia, looking for the good old days of 1730, whatever. Looking for the old days of, in effect, Empress Maria Theresa. But the next opera that they undertook, Strauss and Hofmannsthal, was Die Frau und Schatten, which they began working on around 1911. And I think it's important that we say that because maybe the clouds of war and change were visible, but they had not happened yet. So they were creating an opera about a story that I'm going to have you tell succinctly, if that's at all possible, about something or about some things that then changed, number one, with the arrival of the First World War, number two, the sudden change in who was in charge of the Habsburg family and what they represented, and number three, the end of the war that came not as expected with a victory for Austria and its allies, but for the United States, for France, for Italy, and so forth. And Britain, sorry, leaving out Great Britain. What did Strauss and Hofmannsthal start out wanting to do with Die Frau und Schatten? And yes, the link to Mozart, I meant to say that again. The magic flute, yeah.
So let me start with the link to Mozart. They certainly understand Der Rosenkavalier to have a certain relation to Mozart's Le Nozze di Figaro, with the Marschallin as a modernist appreciation of Mozart's Contessa, and perhaps with Octavian in breeches like Cherubino. What they're looking for in Die Frau und Schatten, which is a fairy tale opera, which is something that is a very special genre. They're looking for something that will reflect Mozart's Magic Flute, which is the greatest of fairy tale operas to that point. And probably remains the greatest of fairy tale operas, though I have other things to say about the history of fairy tale opera in the 19th century. They're both interested in fairy tales, Strauss and Hofmannsthal. Strauss conducted the premiere of Humperdinck's Hansel and Gretel.
Which is a better fairy tale opera, as is Rusalka.
And Hofmannsthal writes fairy tales as a precious young genius. Writing fairy tales is one of the things that he does. So they both look to the magic flute, and what they're interested in most in the magic flute is the idea of royalty undergoing tests and trials to prove its worthiness. A young prince in the magic flute, Tamino, and then in Die Frau ohne Schatten, a young empress who has to undergo tests and trials to prove that she is truly human and worthy to rule over humans. And in that sense, they're looking over their shoulders to the magic flute all the time. They have some thoughts about Hansel and Gretel as well. I can talk about that later if you'd like. But for them, the magic flute is the crucial work that they have in mind as they're preparing this opera. They mean it to be something solemn. They mean it to be something ultimately joyous and triumphant. They mean it to be a little bit of a political parable. For Hofmannsthal, I would say further, almost a work of political theology, what it means to imagine a renewed and truly human empire based on truly humane emperors and empresses. This is important to me in writing the book because one of the things that I feel we forget when we see Die Frau ohne Schatten is that both Hofmannsthal and Strauss lived in empires. They lived as subjects of emperors and empresses. Emperors and empresses were not just fairy tales for them. I've told you the Habsburgs were Holy Roman emperors going back to the 15th century and are still emperors when Hofmannsthal is born in 1874 and are still emperors when Hofmannsthal and Strauss begin to work on Die Frau ohne Schatten in 1911. So for me, the most crucial thing in the book, the most important argument for me is that a work which begins to think about fairy tale emperor and empress in a world where there are real emperors and empresses is finally completed in a world where emperors and empresses have been dismissed and have actually become fairy tales, as they kind of are for us, right? For us, they remain fairy tale figures. And I think that's true all over the world except in Japan.
But interestingly, we can see where they lived. We can visit palaces all over Europe, especially in France, Germany, Austria, other countries too, but those three, somewhat in St. Petersburg, and see how they lived and form opinions about their lives, whether we want to emulate that or we want to rebel against that, or a bit of both. So they began writing this, Hofmannsthal and Strauss, what I know, very actively exchanged letters and communication, and Strauss asked for rewrites and cuts and so on, and Hofmannsthal fine-tuned the character definition. I'm going to say parenthetically that of the great Strauss operas, this is the one I understand the least. I won't say like or dislike, that's a different sensation. But I'm hard put to explain the story, and I can explain almost all the other stories, Daphne, all the Strauss operas, not Feuersnot and not Guntram, but the other big ones I certainly can. This one, maybe because it's a fantasy, maybe because so much is indirect and implied, maybe because there's a bit of black magic in the character of the nurse, maybe because there are creatures that animals that play roles, gazelles and falcons and so on. Yes, it does seem to evoke the magic flute, the opera Die Zauberflöte, but with all kinds of other intentions. I don't see nostalgia here the way I did in Rosenkavalier. What I see is metaphor. I see reaching out to contemporary audiences, initially 1911 when they began, but then we have 1914 with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. And then suddenly, he was Karl. I don't know what his title was before. Was he Prince, Duke, whatever he was?
Oh, was an Archduke.
Archduke, okay. becomes next in line in succession to become the emperor of the I still call it Austrian Empire, for lack of a better term. And he was recently married to Zita, and Zita was of Italian and Portuguese origin, among many things. And Karl was mainstream Habsburg, but with a lot of mix in there, because of all this intermarriage and so on that happened in generations before. And suddenly we're in World War I. Austria fighting alongside Germany and other allies, and the war is proceeding. Opera is still being produced at the Vienna State Opera.
Yes, it
which is, I think, a very important thing to underline, that suddenly it's not that opera stopped, because, for example, in the opera house in Kiev and Odessa, famous opera houses, they've not been able to produce that much right now. I'm not saying they should, but the fact is it's not happening. But at the Vienna State Opera, almost all during World War I,
and World War II.
World War II, but that's for another book.
Yeah.
They kept producing opera. And audiences still went and saw opera, and there were new titles and older titles and so on. And stars such as Maria Yuritsa and Lotte Lehmann were being minted and followed, and works were being created for them. And I mentioned these two because they started Die Frau und Schatten, but there were many. And so therefore, Vienna remained a vibrant cultural capital during war, but the politics changed. So now, Larry, take over with the evolution of the composition of Die Frau und Schatten, with Karl becoming the next in line with his marriage to Zita. I'll parenthetically say they had 8 children, and he died at the age of 34, so therefore they were busy. But also, as the war evolved and what was happening in the national mindset of Vienna and Austria, with opera, war, and change of leadership. Go ahead.
So they're working on this from 1911 until 1914. They've gotten as far as the libretto for Act 1, which Strauss is writing a piano score for as the war breaks out, the piano score for Act 1, and he's got some of the libretto for Act 2 as well. Hofmannsthal is summoned for military service as a reserve officer as soon as the war breaks out. Strauss writes a letter to Hofmannsthal's wife, Gertie, in which he says, tell Hugo that he has the damn duty not to die for the fatherland before I have the libretto for Act 3, which will bring him more glory than a beautiful obituary in the Neue Freie Presse. Which is an interesting note to give you a sense of both the seriousness of the situation and the inability to take seriously the seriousness of the situation at that moment. It shouldn't have been as much of a shock for them as it was, but it clearly took them by surprise over the course of the summer of 1914 to find themselves living in 2 countries that go to war. End of August, Strauss is finishing the piano score to Act 1. He writes, glory to our great German fatherlands, victory to our German troops. He actually writes it on the score as he's finishing Act 1. And I think we can talk a little bit about this later, that the music itself becomes much more serious, right, than originally conceived over the course of the war, because they're writing it over the course of a period in which 10 million soldiers will die on the battlefields, right, during World War I. And the work acquires a very solemn character that I think is marked by the war itself. It's not as light as the Magic Flute by any means. And they're working on 2 projects simultaneously, one of which they think of as the small project, Ariadne auf Naxos, and one of which they think of as the big project, Die Frau ohne Schatten. And Die Frau ohne Schatten acquires solemnity, gravity, weight that they was possibly not how they saw it when they started out from the beginning. That said, over the course of the war, they decide they're going to hold the opera back for the end of the war. They're not going to produce it during the war. They do produce the second version of Ariadne of Naxos in Vienna in 1916. There's a first version that's produced in Dresden, I think in 1912, and a second version that's produced in Vienna in 1916 during the war as lighter entertainment, with both Jeritza and Lehmann in the cast in 1916. But Die Frauen Schatten, they're going to hold back for the end, but they think they're holding it back for the victory. That is to say that they'll celebrate the triumph of their emperors with a triumphant fairy tale about an emperor and an empress who achieve humanity and prove that they are worthy to rule. Meanwhile, 1916, during the war, the Habsburg Emperor Franz Joseph dies. He has been ruling for, I want to say, 68 years at that point. Nobody can remember any other emperor in the Habsburg monarchy. And I want to say that all four of my grandparents were born as his subjects and remembered him very well, into their old age in America. That is to say, I can remember them talking to me about the Emperor Franz Joseph. I come from an Habsburg Jewish family. My grandparents remembered the Emperor Franz Joseph as someone who was fair to the Jews. Which is a memory they carried with them into a completely different lives and a completely different world. For the Habsburgs, he's really the figure who represents patriotism. He's been everybody's emperor. He was your father's emperor. He was your grandfather's emperor, as he was my grandfather's emperor. And the loss of Franz Joseph in 1916 is a blow, and very young people, not in the next generation, but in the next generation after that, Karl is his grandnephew, come to the throne, very young emperor, very young empress, come to the throne and have to prove themselves. So suddenly they've become the figures in the opera, right? The opera is about a young emperor and empress who have to prove their humanity. I was looking at today a book about reading a book about war welfare written by my wonderful colleague Kitchen Shah at the University of Indiana. Photographs of the Empress Zita visiting the troops, right? Visiting the war wounded, right? These are people who are trying to prove their own humanity, their worthiness to rule, their worthiness to lead a country in war. And the ultimate proof they want to give of their humanity and their worthiness, and this is historically the most interesting thing about Karl and Zita, is they want to try to pull Austria out of the war. They want to try to make peace. They send overtures to France. They send overtures to Washington, to Woodrow Wilson, about the possibility of withdrawing from the war, which they're trying to do behind the backs of their German allies. They fail to do this, right, to extricate Austria from the war. Austria loses the war together with Germany. Zita and Karl are removed from power. Austria becomes a republic as Germany becomes a republic, leaving Strauss and Hofmannsthal to present their opera about an emperor and empress in a world that no longer has emperors and empresses.
Right.
There's a moment I really like, 1919, the moment of the premiere of Die Frauen Schatten, also the moment that Karl and Zita are banished from Austria forever. They're on a train heading out of Austria for Switzerland, banished forever, though Zita will live long enough to come back. And the fairy tale emperor and empress are stepping up onto the stage at the Vienna Opera House to begin to sing their roles at the very moment that the real emperor and empress are departing.
So the opera premieres. Vienna is no longer an imperial city. It is socially and economically at its knees. There were millions of war dead on all sides, including younger men in Austria, including Vienna, and suddenly there are widows, and there's a population of more women than men. And many of these, not many, but some of these middle-class Viennese women have to take to prostitution and other means just to survive. And there's a radical social shift in Austria in the 1920s, and it becomes so-called Red Vienna. And there's a socialism that arrives, and they build public housing, some of which artist friends of mine in Vienna still live in. And Vienna, in many ways, strangely, through all of this, benefits from a certain social consciousness about doing good for the people in terms of housing, in terms of healthcare, in terms of education, in terms of clean water, things like that, that we are still talking about now. Vienna did 100 years ago to some degree and has kept working at, with then, of course, the horrible interruption of World War II and what followed there, more anti-Semitism. I'm neither praising nor condemning Vienna right now, but just trying to explore the historical facts to the degree that we know them. But the reception for this opera, what was the reception for this opera when it premiered in 1919 at the Vienna State Opera?
So the premiere occurs in October 1919, just after the humiliating Allied peace treaty with Austria, which ratifies the non-existence of the Habsburg monarchy, while at the same time holding Austria responsible for the war. It is a moment of extreme poverty and hunger, facing the coming of winter. And the Chancellor of Austria, Karl Renner, gives a speech about how this is the lowest moment in our, economic fortunes. The winter is going to be truly terrible for us. Gives the speech on October 10th, 1919, very day of the premiere of the Frau ohne Schatten, with its triumphant C major quartet finale at the end of the opera. Almost couldn't be a worse moment for the premiere of this opera. But let me say two things about the reception of the work. So one of the things that I was going to do, and I'm still willing to do it if you want, having done the history of the Habsburg monarchy in 3 minutes, I'm willing to do the plot of Die Frau ohne Schatten in three minutes.
Go for it. I think we're due.
You want that? Do you want that now?
Go right ahead.
Okay. Act 1. An emperor and an empress. He's human. She's a spirit. She is told by a falcon that unless she can obtain a human shadow in 3 days, her husband will be turned to stone. So together with her nurse, who is a complex and sometimes, as you said, diabolical figure, they descend to the human world to look for a shadow. And they look for it in the dwelling of a humble dyer, Barak, and his wife. And the nurse in particular begins—
his nameless wife.
His nameless wife. She is Die Färberin, the dyer's wife. And the nurse in particular begins to try to persuade the dyer's wife to give up her shadow, and with it, her fertility, so that the empress can have her shadow and become human and bear children. That's Act 1. Clear enough? Act 2. The nurse continues her campaign to seduce the dyer's wife into giving up her shadow, while the empress, watching this campaign of seduction, begins to have doubts about the moral conditions under which she is stealing the shadow of another woman, and wonders whether she can really agree to accept another woman's shadow, or whether, as she sings in the spectacular final septet of the act, whether the shadow will have blood on it. Act 3. The dyer's—
Can I ask about the blood without getting too medical? Is the blood a wound? What is the blood?
I think it would be the blood that comes both at the cost of wounding another person. I think we would say it has blood on it in the sense that it will wound another person.
Okay.
Act 3, the Empress goes before her spirit father, and though sorely tempted, refuses to accept the other woman's shadow. She sees her husband turned to stone and still refuses to accept the other woman's shadow. And when she refuses, her husband is restored to life. The dyer and his wife are reconciled, and the two couples, with both women having shadows, right, are reunited with his or her spouse, but also reconciled with each other. Emperor and Empress with their humble subjects. The Emperor and Empress have treated their subjects properly, with respect, humanely, and the empire can live happily ever after. Except that the empire in the real world has just ceased to exist.
Yeah.
How's that for a 3-minute summary?
That's very, very good. I'm going to have more questions for you, but the reason that I twice now have underlined this notion of fertility is because it was an issue in 18th century Austria. It was an issue because Empress Zita produced 8 children.
Yep.
And I will add, in my view, it was an issue because after the death of so many men,
yes,
in World War I, that all over Europe, there were cultural events and promotions and campaigns about repopulating Europe.
Yes.
Because so many millions had died all across the continent. There was a play by Guillaume Apollinaire called Les Mamelles de Tiresias, which was about repopulation, let's say, but it was written in a very serious tone, and it was written in 1903. And it had been seen a little later by young Francis Poulenc, who turned it into sort of an ironic comic boulevard opera in 1945 about the repopulation of France and the rediscovery of who we are in France after World War II. So the notion of art being used to promote repopulation, having lots of sex, fecundity, fertility, whatever, is not new. And it's about regeneration. It's about rebirth. It's about renewal. It's about all those rewords that we can think of. And that must have been in the air in Vienna. Maybe not in an immediate way. Maybe people were too exhausted and shocked, not just at the fall of losing the war, but the fall of an empire that lasted for many centuries, of an identity, of a commercial connection that extended basically from the Baltic to the Adriatic to much further. And suddenly Austrians had to become accustomed to the smaller proportion that they had become, but surrounded by all the tangible evidence of empire, the beautiful buildings, the food, the customs, the behavior that suddenly was thrown out the window. And throw in Dr. Freud and this heightened sense of self-definition and psychological definition that was part of the daily conversation in certain circles in Austria.
I think that's absolutely right, Fred. When Strauss is completing Act 1 at the end of August 1914, after the outbreak of the war, he's got a piece of Hofmannsthal poetry to set, which is very beautiful, in which Hofmannsthal writes poetry for the night watchmen who watch over the homes in, let's say, Vienna, including the home of the dyer and his wife. And the night watchmen here are not protecting public safety exactly. They're trying to preserve a quiet atmosphere so that men and women can make love to each other in their marital beds. And the watchmen sing, "You, spouses, Ehegatten, you are the bridge by which the dead return to life." which already in August 1914 is something that's so powerful and meaningful. And Strauss gives it everything he's got, the trio of the Night Watchmen. So it's a solemn hymn to the dead returning to life, with pianissimo trumpets and trombones. It's so gorgeous. And Hofmannsthal then, for the third act, demands a sound miracle, a Klangwunder, which is going to be the chorus of the unborn children of future, right? The Ungeborene, who very unfortunately become mixed up with the language of reproductive rights in the later.
And that was actually my next
century.
question for you. Are you happy with that term?
It's a term that they used long before that was a term that was used in discussion about reproductive rights. They certainly are not thinking about reproductive rights or abortion issues. They are thinking, as with the Night Watchman, of what it means for the dead to return to life, the children whom, just as you say, will repopulate the new world that follows the war, children who are waiting in a other spiritual realm to enter into our world. Musically, I see them as being a little bit connected to what Humperdinck does at the end of Hansel and Gretel, when the Kuchenkinder return to life, right? Having been baked into cookies by the witch, and a little bit related even to the three boys in the Magic Flute, the Drei Knaben, and the use of children's voices to represent a different kind of spiritual guidance that can come from a different dimension.
So, Larry, I am pretty certain I've seen you intermittently in many years at my class I teach at NYU on Italian opera. I've seen you at the Met. I know your wonderful wife. I knew her independent of you before I knew you were both married. Wonderful journalist. And but I'm pretty certain I've never told you about the first time I saw Die Frau ohne Schatten.
Oh, tell me about that.
I don't tell that very often. I wrote an article about it maybe 15 years ago. But my first professional job in opera was in 1972 when I was 16. And not too long after that, I moved to Italy and did a lot of my training, was already working in opera houses, primarily in Bologna, still as a teenager. And occasionally was taken by professors or teachers, whatever, to other theaters, including La Scala. And one of my first performances attending at La Scala was an Aida with Montserrat Caballé and Grace Bumbry in 1976. And I was in a box with a rather imposing woman who had a real Jaguar coat and was very wealthy and spoke a little bit of English, and I spoke a little bit of German at the time. But we somehow communicated with those two languages and a lot of Italian. And she said to me, well, if ever you come to Munich, I'd like you to be my guest in my home and we'll go to an opera. She was some kind of Bavarian titled royalty, and I didn't know that. And she lived in a mansion in the Englischer Garden, which is sort of the Central Park of Munich. And she was politically quite right-wing, I would come to discover. And I wrote to her, because this is what we did at the time, saying that I intended to be in Munich in early October of 1976, and could I take her up on her offer? And she said yes. And I wrote back that I have to leave at midnight. My train goes back at midnight on October 3rd, 1976, back to Bologna. And it was an overnight train. And she said, fine, I have tickets at 5 p.m. for an opera called Die Frau ohne Schatten, which I'd never heard of. And would I join her in the royal box, as it turned out? And I was a student, 20 years old, and I had my best little corduroy blazer and a burgundy turtleneck, and that was my best clothing at the time. And I arrived, and there was a very formal, elegant older man with silver hair and a red sash. And he was her friend, and they were both some kind of royalty. He was more royal than she, and he was left wing and she was right wing. But they got along, and in this royal box, they stood, and the entire audience stood for them. The royal box had an anteroom. This is at the Bavarian State Opera. And it was Sunday, October 3rd, 1976. There was a national election between Helmut Schmidt, who was the sitting chancellor of Germany, and Franz Josef Strauss, who was the governor of the state of Bavaria, where we were. And there were posters all over Munich for Helmut Schmidt, Schmidt bleibt, Schmidt remains, or the future with Franz Josef Strauss. So everybody was talking politics. Everybody knew that this right-wing woman and this left-wing man, who were friends and royalty and represented an older era, they both remembered World War I, not to mention World War II, were to be treated with respect, and people were bowing and scraping and so on. And I knew nothing about Die Frau nicht Schaden. I had no time to prepare to read the libretto, look at the score, nothing. And the curtain came up, and there was Leonie Rieseneck, and there was James King, and then later there was Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau, and there was Birgit Nilsson. This was the cast, and Karl Böhm conducting. And the audience went absolutely wild. And at the long intermissions, because in Munich they do long intermissions, we went to the anteroom. There was magnificent spreads of food and champagne and everything. And this was part of my experience with Die Frau nicht Schaden that time. And at the second intermission, Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau came up to join us in the box for a little snack in the anteroom. Now, as a kid, I knew Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau. He was here in New York at Fairmount. He knew members of my family. He was our guest at our table for dinner. And when he saw 20-year-old me, he gave me a big hug in his costume and makeup and said, "Freddie, what are you doing in Munich?" And these two famous, her name was Maria and his name I forget, but they had titles, and he referred to, I think, the Count, the Gräfin, things like that. And I said, well, I'm her guest, and we met at La Scala, and I've just met the Count now, and this is a wonderful boy, and he studied music, and how nice of you to invite him, and will I see you after the performance? And I said, well, only briefly, because I have to get to the Hauptbahnhof, the railway station, for my midnight train to Bologna. And so after the performance, delirious cheering, the audience went wild. I had no clue what was happening on the stage. My German was non-existent then. And then Birgit Nilsson came up, and Leonie Rieseneck came up, and they all started eating and feasting. And that's the first time I met both Leonie and Birgit. And Leonie and I went on to become pretty good friends for a long time. And all of this happened on that night. And I had to sneak out. The Baroness's car took me to the railway station about 11:20, and I got on my train, and I woke up in Bologna. It's as if the whole thing had been a dream, because there I was going back to my student housing in Bologna.
Wow,
And
what a story, Fred.
That was my first Die Frau nicht Schaden, and I remained in touch with Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau. Leonie and I, 2 years later, became friends. We worked together. I worked a little with Nielsen, but it was not the same kind of relationship. And all of that ties back to that night. So it's not that I can tell you every single time I had seen every single opera. That one I remember. I had not yet seen Madame Butterfly, which I would only see another 2 years later. So to give you a context of where in my opera-going life and preparation, it came pretty early. I was 20 years old and didn't have a clue. And it took, when Rieseneck came to New York and Mignon Dunn played the nurse and different people were playing the dyer's wife, for me to begin to form an acquaintance with this opera. I certainly respect it. I admire the craft. There are many people who I know and love and respect who think it's the greatest Strauss opera. I have a few friends who think it's the greatest opera of all. I have a friend, I don't know if you know him, named Hugo Shirley, who is a scholar in England, who wrote his doctoral thesis about Die Frau nicht Schaden. He then worked for Adagio for a while, but I knew Hugo for many years before. And you talk to Hugo about Die Freundliche Schatten, and then he wells up with emotion about what a masterpiece this is. So I'm not saying it's not. I'm just saying that my relationship to it is more of musical admiration and a lot of bafflement rather than something that I engage with more deeply, which I do with Electra, Ariadne of Naxos, and Arabella, among the Strauss operas. They're all great. But
interesting. What an inspirational story.
yeah. So I'm very connected to it in ways I'm not to most operas, which is part of what got me so excited about reading your book, which let me show to viewers again, The Shadow of the Empress, which is a wonderful title now that we know what it's about. But talk, Larry, now about, I know, but I want you to talk about it. What happened in 1920 with Strauss and Hofmannsthal and Max Reinhardt and certain other people relating to Austrian culture, but I would also say politics, renewal, and also maybe the beginnings of the politics and culture politics that led to World War II.
Mm-hmm. So Hofmannsthal and Reinhardt particularly are very committed to the idea of thinking through the cultural identity of this brand new country, Austria. It's been a piece of the Habsburg monarchy for centuries, but it's never been a little independent country of its own. And Hofmannsthal, during the war, did a lot of thinking and writing. This was part of his military service about the identity of the old monarchy and the question of political identity, which I think is really important for Die Freundliche Schatten also, is one that's very much on his mind in the world of the post-war republic. And basically they create the Salzburg Festival in the aftermath of the war. Strauss is a partner because he's the musical director of the Vienna Opera during the years following the war, working together with conductor Franz Schalk. They're doing it together during that period. And the idea of cultural renewal and cultural identities very much on their minds. For Hofmannsthal, it's largely I would say a conservative project. He's a conservative cultural figure in the 1920s. He doesn't belong to the world of Red Vienna that you were talking about before. He creates a Christian mystery play, Jedermann, for the new Salzburg Festival, and he sees it, because it's Salzburg, about preserving a Mozartian cultural legacy for the new Austria. I'm thinking back to the cultural elements of the old monarchy. I'm thinking what is most precious that can be preserved and translated into a new cultural and political idiom. Strauss is not Austrian, right? And
No.
for him, he's interested in participating in the project. And both of them have a little bit of the idea that there's a Catholic, Austrian, Bavarian unity of culture, right? Let's even say Catholic, Austrian, Bavarian, Alpine unity of culture that they can both participate in. But it's really Hofmannsthal's cultural and political obsession. Strauss in 1920, the year of the opening of the Salzburg Festival, isn't actually there. He's gone on tour. There's no music in 1920 for the first festival. It's Jedermann drama.
Yeah.
Strauss is on tour with the Vienna Opera in South America. They're performing in Rio de Janeiro and Buenos Aires. They do Der Rosenkavalier in Rio de Janeiro, I believe. he writes to Hofmannsthal from Rio, when I look out over the bay, I feel like I'm looking out over our empire of the Eastern Islands, which is the empire of Die Frauen
The
Erschaffen.
setting of Die Frauen Erschaffen, yeah.
He believes he's found it in the new world right there. I mean, I think this is a little bit interesting, that this idea that this is an opera that is now has been bereft of the empires that gave birth to it, but that is now in search of a new scenario, right? And it's one that, I think we can say in some sense, Karl Böhm discovers for it in the world of post-war Europe from the 1950s to the 1970s. You were part of that moment, witnessing it in the 1970s and witnessing the acclaim surrounding it. An idea
I'm just going to interrupt. It famously had a magnificent production at the New Metropolitan Opera House in the first season, 1966-67, with Leonie Rieseneck, I'm certain, and I think it was Christa Ludwig, and it was Karl Böhm conducting. And so therefore, it became very much part of the Met DNA. The Met, in its first season of the new house, did 9 new productions. And while Antony and Cleopatra by Barber was very famous, it was challenged as a production, Zeffirelli. And Chagall did a beautiful Magic Flute. But most people, and there was a good Lohengrin, but most people think that the greatest production of the first season was Die Frauen Erschaffen. And I subsequently, when I came back to New York to work at the Met, I learned the opera through that production.
So it's a work that actually does really well for thinking about moments of renewal. And a new Met was one such moment. What you're looking at right behind me, my background is the old Met, where Die Frauen Erschaffen was never performed, never performed at the old Met. And it was General Manager Rudolf Bing, who came out of Vienna, right? Who came out of Hofmannsthal's world in old Vienna, needed to be persuaded by Karl Böhm that 1966 was the moment to present Die Frauen Erschaffen in a new opera house, just as Böhm himself presented it for the moment of renewal in 1955, when the Vienna Opera House had been rebuilt after the war. Böhm, like Strauss in Rio de Janeiro, and Böhm, of course, worked closely with Strauss through some very dark and scary times, had a powerful sense of what this opera could mean in the post-war world, and almost a missionary zeal for bringing it to new worlds. That said, I do want to point out that the Met production was not the first American production in 1966. It was performed in San Francisco in 1959, 7 years earlier. And San Francisco, just this spring,
in
produced
June, I know, with Nina Stemma,
their own company centennial.
Right, I know that. So, Larry, let's get back to our old friends Carl and Zita, because after they were run out on the rails from Vienna and they lived in Portugal, he died at the age of 34 of apparently pulmonary disease. You read the accounts that he caught a cold, going out to buy a toy for his son. But this meant that Zita was a widow with 8 children. And when I did my introduction and welcomed people in places like Quebec, and Brussels and Lisbon and so on, it was in honor of Zita, because she went on to have a very long, interesting life. Obviously, I don't think that Hofmannsthal and Strauss planned to model the Kaiserin, the Empress, in their opera on Zita, but there are a lot of interesting reflections and contrasts between Zita and the Empress. Go for it.
So, see, as I've suggested, Zita is trying to prove herself as a humane empress for the future, right? Between 1916 and 1918, at the very moments that Hofmannsthal and Strauss are trying to think about what it means for an empress to prove her own humanity. Zita's someone who enters my life in a very strange way, because I ended up serving on the Roman Catholic Church committee, which considered and is still considering her for beatification and sainthood. And the reason I was involved in this is because Zita, in the course of her very long lifetime, right after Karl's death on Madeira, she goes to Spain. From Spain, she goes to Belgium. But from Europe in 1940, she ends up fleeing from Hitler's Europe and going to the United States. She arrives at LaGuardia in 1940 on the Pan Am Dixie Clipper. And because she spent the war years in America and Canada, the church needed a American historian of the Habsburg Empire to contribute to the accumulation of archival material that they were evaluating when considering her for beatification and sainthood. And that's how I became connected to her in this somewhat unusual way.
Would you digress a bit and talk about how Karl received recognition from Pope John Paul II?
Karl was beatified in 2004. Karl was beatified in part because he was a devout Catholic, but in part because he, and this was officially stated, because he sought to make peace between 1916 and 1918 and to extricate Austria from the war. And that was really interesting to me, because the Emperor in Die Frauen Schatten is a redemptive figure. When he's turned back from stone into a live human being, Hofmannsthal writes to Strauss, he must have a Gralserzählung, right? Like Lohengrin's Infernum, because he's a redemptive figure. And Strauss writes it for him, his Gralserzählung. And here's the real emperor, almost a century later, serving as a redemptive figure in a different fashion for the modern church. The John Paul II liked to make saints and liked to beatify people, which is the first step towards sainthood. But he has a very special relation to Karl. We think that Karol Wojtyła was named for Emperor Karl because his father was a subject of the Habsburg Emperor, as my grandfather was a subject of the Habsburg Emperor. And when Zita went to Rome in the 1980s for an audience with John Paul II, this is before the beatification, she's already almost 90 when she goes, and she kneels down before the Pope, and the Pope lifts her up and says, "Rise up, Empress of my father."
Wow.
So I want to emphasize this, not just because it's a great story, because for me in this book, it's really important to me to have people understand how close the world of emperors and empresses really is to us. It's the world of my grandparents. It's the world of John Paul's father, Empress of my father. It's not of a fairy tale remoteness, which is how you might first approach the subject and how you might now understand the opera, looking at it from the beginning of the 21st century. This world of emperors and empresses is really close to us. It's, generationally close to us. And I came to understand that better over the course of writing this book, which is about the opera. It's about Karl and Zita, but it's also a little bit about my own family as Habsburg subjects. All of my grandparents were subjects of Karl and Zita between 1916 and 1918, as they were subjects of Franz Josef before that. And that's also true for millions of Americans who come from families who emigrated from the lands of the Habsburg monarchy.
By any chance, did you ever meet Zita or any of her children?
I never met Zita or any of her children. I've come archivally close to her. That is to say, I've read her FBI file. I've looked at her immigration papers, in which she writes, when she gives her name, it says other names by which you are known. She writes down below it, Queen of Hungary.
Wow.
And so I'm archivally close to her, but I never met her. And to be honest, when she died in 1989, I was surprised that she was still alive.
Yeah.
She was 96 years old in 1989, and it seemed amazing to me that she was still alive, connecting us to that world of the old Habsburg monarchy all the way at the end of the Cold War. There she was, massive funeral in Vienna.
Yeah.
And super interesting detail here is at the funeral, when she is interred in the Kapuzinergruft, where
Yep.
all the Habsburgs are interred, you can see where she's buried today.
I've seen her.
The Vienna Boys Choir sing
Oh.
for her interment. In that year, 1989, they also, in Vienna, record the chorus of the unborn children for Georg Schulte's first ever digital recording of Die Frau ohne Schatten. So the Vienna Boys Choir goes right from singing in Vienna for the real Empress at her funeral to singing for the fairy tale operatic Empress in the Schulte recording. What I'm interested in is the convergence here between history and fairy tale.
Convergence, but also I think some could say fetishism. I will say cultivation of this connection to the past. I adore Vienna and I go there as much as I can. It's really one of my favorite cities in the world. But part of what I love about it is not just its modernity, it's a wonderful modern city, but the way you can feel everything in their history, and people live it, they know it. When you go to the Zentralfriedhof, the main cemetery of Vienna, there are musicians' graves and composers' graves, and I go there to leave flowers for Leonie Rieseneck because we were close. And people can connect to the past, all the wonderful things of the past, but also the terrible things of the past. That year of 76, when I went to Die Frau in October, I actually had a little job at the Vienna State Opera in April of 76. And that was my first time in Vienna when I was 19. And I met people who were in the Second War and sometimes the First War. And they were not always friendly and hospitable to this American boy, but I got to speak to them and learn from them. I want to conclude just with a few things. One is that listeners can go to the show page and find Larry's wonderful selections from Die Frau ohne Schatten, and from two that you can listen to, and two of the principal singers, Maria Jeritza, who sang the Empress, and Lotte Lehmann, who sang the Dyer's Wife. Now, my dad was a musician, and in 1962, he went and took master classes in California with Lotte Lehmann. Wow. And she was his favorite. I, working at the Metropolitan Opera, Maria Jeritza lived in New Jersey for a long time, for much of her life, used to come by the Met. And I got to meet her on several occasions because I told her the story of having gone to the premiere in Munich and the story I told you. But I asked her more about the fact that she was the first Turandot at the Metropolitan Opera. And we who love opera and who love history love to talk to older artists and conductors and designers and audience members because we learn from them. And part of what I do with this job at Adagio, but also NYU and elsewhere, is try to document this history so that, and record it so it is seen and heard and passed down when you and I are up with the angels listening to Mozart playing Little Concerti, or down in hell listening to Wagner.
So what did Jeritza say to you when you told her about seeing Die Frau ohne Schatten in Munich?
She said, well, I can see that you were very distracted by what was going on that day. And she says, as a 20-year-old boy, you probably didn't have much experience to understand. And I said, yes, and I had no German at the time. So that it was complete, I knew some Strauss music, but at the age of 20, I didn't know it the way I came to learn it. And therefore, it was entirely new. And it was a bit like I saw Parsifal for the first time when I was about 22 or 23. And now I really, experience and love and talk about Parsifal, but it was completely perplexing for a kid then. I saw it in Berlin when I was a student there. But the last thing that I want to conclude with is what happened to Hugo von Hofmannsthal after this?
Hofmannsthal dies tragically young in
Yeah.
1929. And it's a rather terrible story because he dies the day after, I can't remember whether it's the day after or 2 days after, his son commits suicide. And
Hofmannsthal had a stroke.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And for it's obviously a very tragic personal story. It's a interesting story for Strauss also, because for Strauss, right? Remember, tell Hugo not to die before I get Act 3, right?
Yeah.
They're in the middle of working on Arabella, right?
Yeah.
Strauss, Hofmannsthal's just given him the revisions on Act 1 of Arabella, which he is setting at that moment, and Strauss is kind of lost without Hofmannsthal. He spends a fair amount of time trying to think about where he can go with librettists. And of course, I mean, the other complication, right? Terrible that Hofmannsthal dies in 1929, but also in some ways terrible that Strauss lives until 1949, because Strauss then lives through the Third Reich, and it changes a lot about the way we evaluate him and his career, the years that he goes on living and composing and working in the Third Reich. Die Frauen Schatten is performed for Strauss to celebrate his 80th birthday in Vienna in, I want to say 1944. Is that Strauss's 80th birthday?
He was born June of 1864. He was 10 years older than Hofmannsthal.
There's I would want to emphasize how different it is to die in 1929 and to die in 1949, just in terms of what you experience of the terrible middle of the 20th century. Interestingly, Hofmannsthal's wife and children, of course, his wife was born Jewish and has to flee from Austria in the 1930s, as must his children, who are half Jewish through his wife. Hofmannsthal himself, by the Nuremberg laws, has one Jewish grandfather, and interestingly, his work continues to be performed in the Third Reich. Der Rosenkavalier continues to be performed throughout the whole period of the Third Reich in Germany.
And Lotte Lehmann notably left in 1937, left Europe, moved to the United States.
Yes, she did.
She had been married and then was widowed. And then she lived with a woman for many, many decades. And the woman was a psychologist, I think, or a psychiatrist, and wrote about genius. And Lehmann went on to write novels and poetry and was very much a creative artist, and taught at the Music Academy of the West with many great students, including Grace Bumbry and Marilyn Horne, both people I worked with and spoke to them about Lehmann. Marilyn still talks about Lehmann if you ask her, because it was such a powerful influence. And yet it's left, came to America. Part of what happened in the 30s, especially for artists who were against what was happening politically in Germany and Austria, was this outflow to elsewhere, to England to some degree, but primarily to North America, and how it culturally changed everything in North America because of that. And all of this we can trace back to your book, Larry, which is why, this to me was like Wiener Schnitzel and Schlag, and not together, and strudel and coffee and wine and schnapps. It was a complete immersion into that world, but not with nostalgia. That's what I want to underline finally. I didn't feel any nostalgia for that world, but I felt the whole world had been opened up to me. And I've read many books on Austria and the Austrian Empire, the Nervous Splendor and all of that. But this book, maybe because it came through the lens of an opera, told me an entirely new and different story about a place that I love, despite its contradictions, and feel very attached to and somewhat knowledgeable about. But Larry, you taught me all kinds of things with this book, The Shadow of the Empress. And so I thank you.
I thank you, Fred, because I've learned so much about opera from you over the
Oh, well.
years, and it means a lot to me that that you found the book interesting. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. So I'm sure I'll see you at the opera, and best to your beautiful wife. And I'll see you soon. Thank you, Larry Wolff, very much.